This is the SimHanger channel and my name's Mark. Thanks for watching and let's get started. This is the third and final video in my tutorial series covering the very basics of flight planning. And everything we've covered applies to both the PC and Xbox versions. In part 1 we looked at the essential elements covering IFR instrument flight rules and visual flight rules VFR. In part 2 we took it up a notch and created an IFR flight plan in Microsoft Flight Simulator. We also looked at third-party resources that can help us plan more efficiently. Link to all these videos in the notes below. It's strongly recommended that you watch part 1 and part 2 of the flight planning series before continuing with this video. Our flight today will start at Gatwick International in the UK. This is default Microsoft Flight Simulator scenery. But as you can see, the AI traffic has been enhanced. Simple Traffic provides real-world liveries for your AI traffic. Link to my review video once again in the notes below. Highly recommended. We're in the default Airbus 320, so that Xbox users can follow along if they want to. For PC users you can find this amazing Germanwings livery on flightsim.to. We're going to start where we ended the previous video. In that video we created a flight plan from Gatwick International in the UK to Stuttgart in Germany. Cruising at 29,000 feet, we planned it as an IFR flight using high altitude airways. We planned a SID or standard instrument departure out of Gatwick and a STAR or standard terminal arrival into Stuttgart, as well as an ILS, approach runway 07. In terms of flight planning, and flight planning in IFR particularly, there are many aspects to take into account, so I thought the best way of explaining it and showing you is to actually do the flight. Our passengers are on board, ATC has given us clearance, and we're now taxiing onto the runway, prepping for takeoff. In this video we're going to be looking at how do we fly a standard instrument departure. We'll also be looking at what's the difference between altitude and a flight level. When flying IFR, what are the constraints on the various airways? How do we identify them? And how can we manage a cruise, our descent, our standard instrument arrival, and our prep for an ILS approach in accordance with the regulations. This tutorial is aimed at beginners and at those unfamiliar with flight planning and flying a flight plan. I will make some generalization, some deliberate omission, as the overall objective is to keep it simple and understandable. Lastly, I would also note that this is a tutorial on flying an IFR flight plan, and not on flying the Airbus A320neo. I'm using that aircraft because that's the one that we used for our flight plan originally. So please excuse any errors or omissions in terms of flying the Airbus. Welcome to the Airbus 320 cockpit, and we can see there on our secondary display our flight plan. And we'll be having a look at that in a little bit more detail just now. What I want to do is turn your attention to this switch here. This is where we set our barometric pressure, and by doing so we'll set the correct altitude for the airport. Note as I turn the dial, so the elevation or altitude on the primary display is changing. Furthermore, it has two different settings, HG and HPA. HG or inches of mercury is used in the States and other parts of the world, and HPA or hectopascals is used predominantly in Europe. Inches of mercury, HG or hectopascals, HPA, are simply two different units of measure for air pressure. Have you ever wondered how your altimeters work? Well, they work measuring air pressure. Both units of measure have a standard, and that's the standard atmospheric pressure at sea level. For inches of mercury it's 29.92, and for hectopascals it's 1013. And having a standard makes a whole lot of sense. By using a standard, all altimeters are reading the same, thus reducing the chance of an accident mid-air. This standard of measurement is called QNH, or height above sea level. All aircraft flying worldwide will use the standard barometric pressure when they're flying above a transition level. Below the transition level, all aircraft use a local pressure setting. That will be defined for them by ATC or gained from online sources if no ATC is available. And why is that? Well, we've all watched weather reports and seen high and low pressure areas. So the actual air pressure is variable and can change from one hour to the next. So at lower altitudes, aircraft use the actual pressure setting applicable at that time, therefore assuring that the altitude they're flying at will clear any obstacles in their way. The point at which you change from a local pressure setting to a standard pressure setting is called the transition level. The transition level altitude varies from country to country and in some cases region to region. In the United States, for example, the transition level is 18,000 feet. In Dutch airspace, it's 3,000 feet. In the UK, well, it varies region to region. In the south of England, it's 6,000 feet and varies between 3,000 and 4,000 feet in other areas. So when flying either a VFR or IFR route, you need to know the transition level so you know when to change your barometric pressure setting. Generally speaking, altitudes below the transition level are given to you in feet, so it's 3,000 feet, 6,000 feet and so on. Altitudes above the transition level are referred to as flight levels. So for example, if we're flying in the States, we'd be instructed to climb to say 7,000 feet, whereas if we're in the UK, we'd be instructed to climb to flight level 70. Most aviation charts and maps will clearly indicate the transition level applicable. Whilst not applicable to what we're doing today, there are a number of countries that don't measure altitude in feet, but in meters, such as China and Russia and so on, but we won't be looking at that in any detail today. Being at Gatwick, in the south of England, the transition level is 6,000 feet, so I can't use the standard pressure setting. I need to get my local QNH or pressure setting. So I've pulled up the METAR for Gatwick, Echo Golf Kilo Kilo, and there I can see its winds are 1 knot at 280 degrees and my QNH is 1041. After takeoff and once I'm through the transition level, I'll have to change to standard pressure, which is 1013 hectopascals. But right now I need to change to 1041 hectopascals. There we are, that's set, and we can see that the altitude on the main display has changed, now displaying just over 200 feet, which is approximately correct. As we're in the A320, let's quickly turn our attention to the flight plan. We'll be looking at the flight plan in different ways during our flight, so let's just quickly familiarize ourselves with the various views. This dial here just changes our range from 10, 20, 40, 80 nautical miles and so on, and the left-hand dial changes the type of display. It's the same information, just in a different format. If I turn it all the way to the right to plan, I'm now able to check my flight plan and step through the various legs by clicking on the up arrow key. And I'm doing this just to check that my flight plan is as expected. Normally, of course, you would do this before getting on the runway. And as you step through the various legs of the flight plan, you can of course use the rangefinder to zoom in and out so you can see more or less detail. My preference and common setting is to use the arc view. And as we're going to be departing, I'm going to turn the range right down to its minimum 10 nautical miles. Another very handy feature that the A320 has is this button here, your constraints button. And by clicking this on, it will indicate various altitudes that are required for the SID, STAR or Airway. And this will become particularly important when we start planning our descent. In addition to this information, you will need to refer to various maps. In this case, I'm using the InSim Navigraph. My flight plan has been loaded in. I've selected Gatwick, and if you recall, we selected the MIMFO departure. So again, I can have a quick look at the detail here. Looking at this chart, we can see various bits of information. For the first 2.3 miles, I need to remain between 1,500 and 4,000 feet. At D29 det, not above 4,000 feet. 5,000 feet by Acorn, and 6,000 feet by MIMFO. And I'm saying feet because I'm below the transition altitude. We can see right at the top of the chart it clearly states our transition altitude is 6,000 feet, and once completed the SID, MINFO is the point at which my route starts. So the detail on this chart is really what you should plan for, although of course ATC can vary it, and in the real world, well, they quite often do, depending on traffic circumstances. For this departure, ATC have given me an altitude of 5,000 feet and a speed not exceeding 250 knots. And 250 knots is a general limitation if you're flying below 10,000 feet. So you can follow me during the flight. Let's familiarize ourselves with the autopilot quickly. The switches are push-pull switches. Hover your mouse over it. If the arrow points up, it's push, and if the arrow points down, it's pull. As a general guideline, if you push, then the aircraft computers will manage the autopilot. If you pull, then you have manual control of the autopilot. We can control the speed and the heading, and if we pull that, it's nav, the auto throttle, altitude, and our vertical climb or descend. The Airbus also has different modes for some of these activities, but we will not be covering them in this video. We're now ready for takeoff. Just check all the lights are okay, which they are. Arm the speed brake. There we are, that's done. And now take off the parking brake. After letting the engine spool up, we move the throttles to flex or take off power. Once we take off, things will happen very quickly. Whilst my autopilot is not engaged, nav mode and auto throttle have been set, and I'll move my throttle to climb at about 1500 feet, which will allow auto throttle to engage, and the computers on board will control my airspeed. The Airbus 320 is a modern aircraft and designed to be flown on autopilot. Rotate 140 knots, and at 500 feet above the ground, gear up. My flaps are set 1 notch down, maintaining a pitch between 15 and 19 degrees. Autopilot now on, and bring my power back to climb so that the aircraft controls the airspeed. We're following a standard instrument departure, and we can see the aircraft is already beginning to bank. At this point the aircraft will continue to climb but not go over 5,000 feet. We can see here that the aircraft is following the standard instrument departure, and we're just turning onto our outbound leg, and we can see our autopilot settings on the main display. We're getting closer to our 5,000 feet, so the aircraft will now start reducing its climb and prepare to level out at 5,000 feet. At this stage in our IFR flight, we are either constrained by that dictated on the standard instrument departure, or in this instance, the restrictions placed on me by ATC of 5,000 feet altitude and a speed not exceeding 250 knots. Flaps are up at about 190 knots, and I will continue to fly the standard instrument departure until I'm clear of constraints or ATC instruct me to climb. I should be at 5,000 feet by Acorn and 6,000 feet by MINFO. It's not that busy around Gatwick at the moment, and so ATC have given me an instruction to climb to 6,000 feet a little bit earlier. So that's what I'll do. I'll now climb to 6,000 and hold that until instructed by ATC anything further, or clear of the constraints of the standard instrument departure if not using ATC. As our original flight plan included the standard instrument departure, by looking at our flight plan we can find out additional information. Our next waypoint is highlighted in white, Acorn, and altitude restrictions for each waypoint are given. Note the waypoint cock. There's also a restriction there. It's showing flight level 195 or 19,500 feet, but at the end there's an A. That A means above. Aircraft must be higher than 19,500 feet when crossing that point. Now passing Acorn and heading to MINFO. Normally we would hold 6,000 feet till we're at MINFO, and if ATC hadn't contacted us, request a climb. In this case I'm assuming ATC have contacted us and told us to climb to flight level 170, 17,000 feet. Once dialed in, I'm pulling out on the altitude switch to feed that information through to the computer. There we are, it's now reflecting on the main display, and for right now I'm going to let the computer manage the climb. In the real world, as my flight path crosses incoming traffic heading towards Gatwick, it's quite common for ATC to give me an early climb instruction and get me out of the way of incoming traffic. We're now climbing above the transition level of 6,000 feet. So we need to set the barometer to standard. That's easy to do, we just pull it out on the Airbus. And as I did, you see the altitude changed, as it reflected a different barometric pressure. Also note on my main display it's changed from 17,000 feet to flight level 170. Whilst we're continuing our climb to flight level 170, let's have a look at a little bit of detail in the flight plan. What we're mainly interested in is any altitude constraints. So let's just pause it here so we understand what we're looking at. Altitudes are shown in magenta. A line underneath means not below. If the line was above, it would mean no higher than. If an altitude is shown with a line above and below, it means at that altitude. Note that the waypoint Ladat 18,000 feet, or flight level 180, has no lines on it. This is a suggested altitude put in by the computer, as Ladat is fairly close to our standard terminal arrival, and it will factor in altitudes required for entry into the star. In the real world, well, ATC may give different instructions. You would and could refer to external charts for more information. I personally use Navigraph as mentioned earlier, mainly because the information is readily available and it supports moving maps, so I can see exactly where en route I am. Note I've passed 10,000 feet or flight level 100, so I can now increase speed above 250 knots. In addition, it's time for those landing lights to come off. The computer is currently managing the speed and will try and take it to 320 knots. I've pulled out the speed knob so I can take control of the speed. I think I'll continue my climb at 280 knots so I can maintain a good rate of ascent. I'm also conscious I've got to be above flight level 195 by cock, but I've got plenty of time as it's 60 nautical miles away. I'm now over the southern coast of England, and ATC has given me final clearance to climb to my cruise altitude of 29,000 feet. So using my autopilot I will dial that in. There we are, 29,000 feet. I'll pull out the knob as I'm managing the altitude and the climb rate manually. And we're on our way. We'll now continue to climb. As the autopilot is looking after the aircraft, we can have a look at a little bit more detail. By clicking on our destination, and from the sub-menu then choosing arrival, we can just check our star is programmed in. It's a Batso 2 Alpha arrival, runway ILS 07. All that looks good. So I'll leave you now, and we'll chat again once we're at cruise. Well, we're just about overhead, waypoint cock, leveling off at flight level 290, just managing my speed. Use this button to change it to Mach. I'm going to look for a cruise of about 0.74. This aircraft is capable of a 0.77, 0.78. We're now going to continue with our cruise and follow our flight plan, and we'll pick up things again as we prepare for our descent. Many flight management systems will have a top of climb and top of descent feature. The default Airbus 320neo does not have that function, so this provides us with an ideal opportunity of how do we manually calculate top of descent and also rate of descent. Looking at the route in front of us, we've got to go through Komob, Dick and Pitts, and then Ladat. And at Ladat we need to be at 18,000 feet, or flight level 180. There are a number of calculations we can do, some rules of thumb that will give us an indication, an idea of when we should start our descent, etc. Let's have a look. So the rough calculation we can do is to take our altitude in thousands, the altitude being the amount of altitude that you want to lose, and then multiply that by 3. And then based on approximately 3-degree glide slope, that's the number of nautical miles required. So taking that formula in mind, let's apply it to our instance. We're at 29,000 feet and we want to descend to 18,000 feet. So the difference is 11,000 feet. Take the 11,000 feet in thousands, so it's 11 times 3, and that's 33 nautical miles. In this instance, I'd like to be at the selected altitude of flight level 180 about 5 nautical miles before Ladakh. So 33 plus 5 is 38. I'm going to round it off at 40 nautical miles before Ladakh is my top of descent. To calculate a 3-degree glide slope, we can use the following rough guide. Take your ground speed, note it is your ground speed and not your true airspeed, and multiply by 5. So in our instance, we can see that our ground speed on the secondary display is 435 knots. Times this by 5 and I get 2,175. So I could plan on a descent rate of 2,200 feet. These calculations are not exact, but they're a fair rule of thumb, and certainly better than nothing. Ladakh is 47 nautical miles away, so time to start preparing for our descent. We want to descend something around 40 nautical miles before. So on the autopilot I've dialed in 18,000 feet or flight level 180, and I'm probably going to regret this, but I'm going to let the aircraft manage the descent. Unfortunately, the autopilot on the Airbus 320 is a little iffy at times, but let's see how we do. We're currently 43 nautical miles away, so I think I'll initialize the descent, just in case it doesn't bring us down fast enough and we need to make some manual corrections. I've pushed the altimeter, so the aircraft will now take control of the descent itself. Let's just give it a minute or two, it just needs to settle down, and I'll give it control of the airspeed as well. Our calculations showed we needed a descent rate of about 2,200 feet. The descent rate's bouncing around a little bit at the moment, but it's probably going to settle around 2,700 feet. So it's going to bring us down a little bit early. While we've done it, so we'll live with it, but for further descents I think we'll do it manually. The transition altitude in Germany is 5,000 feet, so we will remain on standard for this descent. Okay, so whilst the autopilot hurtles us towards 18,000 feet, this is a good opportunity just to remind us of the star and any constraints that apply. It's the BADSO 2 Alpha runway 07, and here it's showing us we need to be at 10,000 feet or flight level 100 by BADSO. Then after that we're gonna fly a defined route to Vata, and by Vata we need to be at 4,000 feet. At that point is when we will switch over to our ILS approach runway 07. But from Ladakh we need to plan on a descent to flight level 100 level by BADSO. Whilst we're here we can also check on the ILS approach. I've chosen the approach tab and ILS runway 07. It's also worthwhile to check the ILS details. From Vata 72 degrees on 109.5. As expected, the autopilot's brought us down early. We're at 19,500 feet. We're still 18 nautical miles to go. What it has correctly managed is the airspeed on the descent has gradually decreased. We're only a few nautical miles from Ladakh and we're level at 18,000 or flight level 180. We planned on reaching flight level 180 5 nautical miles before. It brought us down about 12 nautical miles before. We're 40 miles from BADSO. We need to lose 8,000 feet. Once again divide by 1,000, so it's 8 times 3, 24 nautical miles from BADSO. We need to commence our descent. Conscious of both your time and mine, and what happens fairly frequently in the real world, depending on traffic circumstances for ATC, they may well reroute you to save time and fuel. I'm going to assume that ATC have asked us to proceed directly to Navfix Delta Sierra 414. We can do that by hitting the Direct To button, and then selecting the appropriate Navfix Delta Sierra 414 and then hitting Direct. So now if we have a look at our route, just takes a moment or two to kick in, and there we are. And on our flight plan display under constraints we can see that we need an altitude of 8,000 feet by Delta Sierra 414. So let's plan on that. Whilst we're descending we can check on the METAR for Stuttgart, and again what happens from time to time is that it just doesn't display it. I'm close enough to Stuttgart, it should be showing by now. Now the transition altitude is 5,000 feet, so I'd only need to change then, but it's always good to be prepared ahead of time. We're now 9 nautical miles from Vatta and descending to 4,000 feet. I'm reducing speed to 180 knots. Flaps are 1 notch down. There's a little bit of cloud around, but it's a lovely day for flying. I'm about 4 nautical miles from Vatta. Flaps are 2 stages down, and I've reduced speed to 160 knots. Not far to go now. We will shortly be turning on to final. In preparation, I've hit the LS button, landing system, and this will enable the glide slope and localizer on my primary display as an aid to landing. In the Airbus A320, because both the standard terminal arrival and ILS were programmed in, it'll automatically pick up the ILS, although I will have to hit approach mode. Now completing my turn onto final, ATC has given me clearance to land. My glide slope and localizer are indicating, so hit the approach button to engage ILS mode. And when we look at our primary display, we'll see that both the glide slope and localizer are now active. I'm letting the aircraft control the airspeed and the altitude now, and the descent has started. I still can't get a METAR for Stuttgart for some reason, so I'm going to leave it on standard. Final preparations now for landing. We'll put the landing lights on as well as the taxi lights, and we'll also put the seatbelt and no smoking signs on as well. Cabin crew, prepare for landing. We're about 3.5 nautical miles away from the airport, so time to get the 3rd level of flaps in. That's done now, and we've armed the speed brake. 3,000 feet, 2.8 nautical miles to go. That's the airport, I have that in sight, so flaps can be fully deployed now. Less than 2,000 feet to go now, speed 140. On the localize and glide slope, autopilot is now off.
400. 300. 100. 60. 50. 40.
Now taking thrust to idle.
20. Retard. 5.
Little bit of a hard landing, but we're down. Nose wheel down, and now engaging thrust reversers to help me slow down to about 70 knots. As predominantly a bush pilot, I'll take it. Flaps fully up, landing lights and strobes off as we come off the runway. Many of us in our flight simulation experience are looking for more immersion and more realism. Planning a real-world IFR flight and then being able to execute it just enhances the sim experience overall. And when you get it right, it can be very rewarding. And should you ever want to fly online with IVAO or VATSIM, well, this is great preparation. If you're looking for a crash course on IFR flying in the Airbus 320, then check out FS Academy's Jetliner, available for both PC and Xbox versions. If you're keen to learn more about flying the A320, both the default and the fly-by-wire versions, then I can recommend that you check out 320 Sim Pilot. He's a real-world Airbus pilot and produces some very good quality, easy-to-follow tutorials. Well, for those just starting their flight sim experience or for the first time getting into some flight planning in IFR, I hope that you found this useful and informative. Thanks for watching, and if you made it this far, well, you must be a serious sim pilot. Take care, look after yourselves. I'll see you again very soon, and bye for now.